The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers.
Hello, everyone.
Before we get into tonight's stories, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do. So, Beth, do you want to start us off?
I'd love to. If you could go to your favorite listening platform and leave us a 5-star review and a comment, we would really appreciate it. It helps us move up the list so we can become recommended to listen to, which greatly helps new people find our show.
Also, if you haven't already, check out our website. You can leave reviews there for us, and we have links to our stores, and you can also contact us there and ask us anything you'd like, or let us know if you have a topic that you'd be interested in for an upcoming show, or just say hi. The link is in our show notes at the bottom of every episode.
And one last thing, when you have the time, please follow us on our Facebook page. You can get all the latest information there about upcoming episodes and events.
That you can, and that about wraps up tonight's housekeeping. So, Beth, you want to start us off and tell us where your mind wandered for this episode?
Well, sure. So, tonight, I'm talking about 2 separate UFO encounters, almost 20 years apart, that have some pretty uncanny similarities. Both were in broad daylight. Both involved a craft that contained unusual beings. And both were witnessed by school children while outside of their schools at recess. One of the cases, which happened in 1997, has had all kinds of publicity over the years, from documentaries to books. The other, which actually happened first, was a case I'd never even heard of before. On February 4th, 1977, in Broadhaven, Wales, a group of children were outside for recess. It was a typical school day, but then something unusual happened. A total of 14 children suddenly saw a 50-foot-long cigar-shaped metallic spaceship flying around the perimeter of their schoolyard. Awestruck, they continued to watch it as it flew in circles around the perimeter of their school. Some of the children even swore the UFO landed and creatures in silver suits got out of the craft to look around. At this point, the children began to panic, and they ran inside to tell their teachers. Their teachers just kind of laughed it off as an imaginative game, but the children persisted. Their claims made it to Headmaster Ralph Llewellyn, but he also dismissed them as playing a joke or misidentifying something else.
Now, wait here a moment. Don't you think, being a teacher, you'd at least look out the window, or perhaps just take a stroll outside and look up and see if you could see anything also?
Well, I think I would, but I don't know what other teachers might do. The children, for sure, knew what they had seen, and one of them, David Davies, reported it to the local police. Headmaster Llewellyn then brought each of the 14 children, one by one, into a room and asked each of them to draw what they had seen. He was shocked by how similar all of their drawings were. The BBC Wales had heard about the encounter, and they interviewed several of the children. The reporter at the time suggested that all they had seen was a helicopter. But then, in the following months, other people, adults this time, started coming forward with their own sightings, like Rosa Granville, a hotel owner, who claimed she watched through one of her windows as a metallic UFO landed in a field next to her hotel that April. She told the BBC that, quote, "There was so much heat. I was by the window. My face felt burned. There was light coming from it and flames of all colors. Then the creatures came out of these flames. That's what I don't understand. I shouted, 'Hello, what are you doing there?' They looked faceless. I couldn't see their features." End quote. Granville immediately gathered other people in the hotel to come and see this strange craft. But when they returned to the window, it and the creatures were gone. In the spot where the UFO had been, the ground was scorched. A few weeks later, Pauline and Billy Coombs were watching TV late at night. They lived in a farmhouse that was pretty isolated. The police received a call asking them to get out to the farmhouse right away because both Billy and Pauline had seen a 7-foot-tall humanoid creature standing outside their window, staring in at them. It was wearing a silver outfit. Even more alarming, they swore that where its face should have been, all they saw was a blank, featureless void. When police arrived, they noted that both Billy and Pauline were too frightened to step outside their house. The sightings continued off and on until 1978, when an entire family claimed to have witnessed a massive silver disk circling Stack Rocks, an island off the coast. The family said the UFO flew over their heads and then out to the island. It circled it, and then some sort of invisible door opened in the rocks, and the UFO flew inside the island. Then they spotted 2 figures dressed in silver standing on the rocks. But what about the sighting that kicked it all off? Those 14 school children. In the decades since, skeptics have suggested all kinds of mundane possibilities. They like to return to that helicopter theory, although the schoolyard was surrounded by a heavily wooded area and none of the children reported hearing any noise coming from the craft. They've also proposed that it was simply a military aircraft from the nearby military base. I suppose that's possible, but why the classic UFO shape? And how was it silent? And why didn't the base come forward and put people at ease by saying, it was them?
Well, if it was a helicopter flying around the perimeter, people inside the school would have definitely heard it.
Yeah.
So that makes no sense.
Others say, and this is the one that really gets me, others say it was simply the top of a sewage truck, and the silver men were firefighters. Although, this is why it gets me, because how would the top of a sewage truck appear to be flying around the perimeter of their school?
They're really grasping at straws with that one.
In 1996, a man named Glenn Edwards came forward and said that he was the silver alien the children had seen. He had done it as a hoax. But the children had reported 2 creatures dressed in silver, and that still doesn't explain the craft that they saw. Especially when you consider how David Davies, who spoke to the BBC in 2017, remembers what he saw. He described it as a, quote, pearlescent silvery gray, approximately 40 feet long, torpedo cigar-shaped, with an upper domed section that covered the central third of the vehicle and which was topped with a red pulsating light, end quote. That's not a helicopter or a sewage truck.
No, it's not.
And there's another interesting thing about this case, that after all of these years, every single one of the witnesses still stand by their story. not one of them has come forward and said that they made it all up. And I think the most intriguing part about that is that it happened again almost 20 years later in Zimbabwe. It was a typical school day on September 16, 1994, in Rua, Zimbabwe. The school children, ages 6 to 12, were outside enjoying their usual break time, while the entire faculty was inside attending a staff meeting. At around 10:15 a.m., the children witnessed something extraordinary. 3 metallic discs appeared in the sky, hovering over a field just outside school grounds. One of the discs landed, and as the curious older children pushed closer to the school's property's edge to get a better look, figures emerged from the craft. Shorter than average humans, the figures wore black jumpsuits. They had long black hair. Their faces were unnaturally pale, and their eyes were huge and black. These strange creatures did not speak, but after about 15 minutes, they reboarded their craft and flew away. The children, some of whom had been so frightened that they'd run away as soon as the craft landed, they went immediately to their teachers too, and described what can only be called an amazing UFO encounter. Although highly skeptical, some of the teachers ventured out into the field and found nothing. Brushing it off as just some wild story, the teachers calmed the children and the school day continued. It wasn't until the next day, after the kids had gone home and told their parents about what they had experienced, that the school personnel began to question whether or not the children had actually seen something remarkable.
Well, here's the thing I don't understand. Why weren't there any adults out there monitoring those children in the schoolyard during recess? I mean, you have to have at least one adult out there because, like typical school children, there's going to be arguments and fights. And what if a child gets hurt?
Yeah, that's a good question. The only thing I could think of was maybe wherever they were having their meeting was all windows where they could see out where the kids were.
Right.
I don't know.
And you think even at that case, when you're in a meeting for work and you've got windows and, the speaker's just clamoring on and on and on, you find yourself looking out the window just thinking, I can't wait to get the hell out of here.
Right. Oh, I wonder what all the kids are doing over by the side of the property or the fence or whatever.
Look at the little people in silver outfits with big black eyes.
So, although 1994 wasn't that long ago, the aerial school was quite remote, and the faculty was pretty convinced that the students wouldn't have access to many movies or books about aliens or UFOs. But if it was just some wild story cooked up by just a few students, it should be pretty easy to disprove. The head teacher had the idea to have the children draw what they had seen, just like at Broadhaven. And 62 of the children completed drawings. If it was a prank or a joke, the pictures should run the gamut from different shapes and sizes at the very least. Shockingly, all 62 separate drawings were eerily similar. Each child, regardless of age or cultural background, had drawn a quintessential flying saucer. Several included the same number of shining lights on its side. Almost all of them drew 2 landing pod-like legs on the bottom. Many of them colored the craft silver or labeled it as shiny silver. With just barely 24 hours since the incident, how could 62 children have conspired to draw essentially the exact same thing, unless they hadn't conspired at all and just drew what they had actually seen?
And that's exactly what must have happened.
On September 19th, a reporter with the BBC arrived at the school to talk to the children and to the school staff. He was quoted as saying, "I could handle war zones, but I could not handle this." On September 20th, a local UFO researcher named Cynthia Hind arrived at the school to conduct her own interviews. What she found was pretty interesting. All of the 62 children who said they saw something described what they saw with pretty consistent details, including the small figures in black and the craft itself. But the children did come from different cultural backgrounds, so their interpretations of what they saw were quite different. Some of the children retold their encounter with a definite UFO spin on it, aliens from another world. Some children believed that they had seen a tokoloshi. In Zulu mythology, tokoloshi are dwarf-like mischievous water sprites. They're considered evil since they are called upon by people with bad intent to cause trouble. Tokoloshi can turn invisible by drinking water or swallowing rocks. But for Hind, the fact that these children came up with their own explanations of what they had seen by relating it to their own cultural beliefs was further proof to her that they had all seen the same exact thing. A few months later, Harvard psychiatry professor John Mack arrived to interview the children. Mack's investigation does tend to receive some skepticism and criticism, though, for a few reasons. First, he didn't arrive until 2 months after the event. So those skeptics who say the children could have talked to each other and agreed on what they would say had more of a leg to stand on since a good chunk of time had passed. But keep in mind, they're between the ages of 6 and 12. How are you going to get a 6-year-old, a general everyday 6-year-old, to make sure their story matches up with a 12-year-old?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Also, Mack didn't interview the children separately. Instead, he conducted his interview in groups, allowing for the children to feed off of and elaborate what other children in the group said, according to the skeptics. And those are good points if the interviewees were adults. But they're not. Like I said, they were children, some of them as young as 6. So you'd think that if they were telling each other what to say and they were worried about telling it wrong, they'd be looking at each other while they were talking. And in the footage of the interviews, they definitely do not. Thirdly, Mack was the first one to claim that the children were saying they had received telepathic messages from the little figures in black. These messages were environmental in nature, telling the children to take care of the planet. For example, one 5th grader said he heard, quote, about something that's going to happen, and that pollution mustn't be, end quote. An 11-year-old girl said, quote, I think they want people to know that we're actually making harm on this world, and we mustn't get too technologed, end quote.
Technologed.
Skeptics wonder why these telepathic messages didn't really come up until Mack was involved. Well, my thought about that is maybe that's because he was like a psychiatrist who knew how to interview differently than a UFO researcher or a journalist would. And finally, Mack, like Hind, insisted that the children had very little to no prior knowledge about UFOs and aliens. Skeptics jump all over that because apparently there had been quite a few UFO sightings just 2 days prior to the Ariel School incident, which makes it more believable to me if people were seeing it before then.
It really does.
The official line was that people were witnessing the Zenit 2 rocket from the Cosmos 2020-90 satellite launch re-entering the atmosphere, causing a visible fireball in the sky. But what those kids saw was not a fireball, it was a silver disc with legs and windows. So, Mack has been accused of not conducting his interviews properly, And some academics even suggested that he asked leading questions. And that's why the telepathy suddenly emerged in some of the kids' stories. But keep in mind, at the time, he was employed by Harvard. And then shortly after his involvement in the Ariel school, he was no longer employed by Harvard.
Interesting.
So, he jeopardized his career by doing that. And why would he do that unless he thought it was real?
You would think so.
Now, earlier I had mentioned that the children described what they'd seen with pretty consistent details. The interesting thing to me is that each one of them seemed to remember little details that no one else had. That's pretty impressive to me, because if a bunch of kids memorized like a script or something that, a classmate had written, they should have all been exactly the same without them elaborating. So in addition to that, you'd think if, they were playing a prank, there'd be at least one student with a penchant for drama who would have added some overdramatic flourishes to the story, like, and suddenly they shot fire from their eyes, or, something like that. I can't help thinking, too, that if it happened in the U.S., because remember this was in Zimbabwe.
Yes, that was.
At least in my experience, children tend to flip each other in, right? There's always one or two that's going to come forward and say,
they're lying.
Yeah, or Bobby told me to say it, or whatever. And none of that happened either. So I suppose I should mention the elephant in the room, the possibility that it was all a case of mass hysteria, which skeptics love to throw into the mix when none of the other explanations seem to fit. I don't really have much to say about that, though. Could it have been? I suppose so, since many other students at the school said they didn't see anything unusual at recess at all. But what about all those other kids at the school who didn't see anything that day? How come none of them have come forward and said it was all a big joke or a prank? How come none of them has ever said, oh, it was just mass hysteria?
Well, that's the thing, though. Kids talk. And if it was, it would have been slipped out. One of those kids would have came forward and say, listen, I heard little Susie, Bobby, whatever. I don't know what their names are there. But someone would have said, hey, I overheard this, and they were saying that this is kind of a hoax. But then again, why would they make up something so elaborate like that? It just doesn't make sense for school kids. They'd want to just keep on going and doing their thing at recess time and playing games. And
right.
Why? There's no reason to make this up.
And to this day, none of the children from Broadhaven and not a single one of the 62 children from the Ariel school have come forward and said it was a hoax or a prank. And in fact, it's been the total opposite. The children from the Ariel school are in their 30s and 40s now. And to this day, the ones that are still willing to talk about it, they retell the story the exact same way they did when they were 6 or 10 or 12 years old.
Well, yeah, we saw the documentary and it was super interesting because they were still retelling it the way they had seen it back then. Nothing had changed, really. It was embedded in their mind.
And what I'd like to know is, especially since the Ariel school, there was a big anniversary of it, and there was all those documentaries that came out several months ago. But why hadn't I ever heard of Broadhaven before?
I don't know. I've never heard of it.
No, and it was almost 20 years earlier than that. And it's the exact same scenario, the exact same situation.
Right.
So, 2 separate cases of school children witnessing a UFO. And what intrigues me, like I said, there's a lot that intrigues me about these stories, but how similar those cases are. And they took place 8,000 miles apart.
Well, I'm surprised someone didn't come out and say, oh, this happened all those years ago, and these kids read about it, and now they're just mimicking it.
Well, that was one of the points with the one at the Ariel school in Zimbabwe, is that all the faculty, even the parents, were saying they've never really had any exposure to any of that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
So they wouldn't have heard about it.
No. Well, I love the two stories, dear. And
Me
I
too.
always find when, kids witness, especially a bunch of kids witness something like this and come forward, it just makes it more credible to me.
And you can tell when a kid is telling you something and they have fear in their eyes. I mean, you can tell when they're really, truly afraid of something and,
Yeah.
Hey, did you know? On June 27, 1903, Aida de Acosta, a 19-year-old American socialite, flew a motorized dirigible from Paris to the Chateau de Bagatelle. Although the vessel's owner rode his bicycle a few hundred feet below, her solo piloting trip made her the first human to fly a motorized vehicle heavier than air. Her parents, fearful that no one would want to marry such an independent and daring girl, squashed the story. Which is why so few people have ever heard about her, and why 6 months later, the Wright brothers got all the credit for being the first to fly a mechanical plane, even though they weren't the first. Who'da thunk it? So where did your mind wander this week?
Well, if you find yourself visiting Cheesman Park in Denver, Colorado, you can enjoy a beautiful, pristine expanse of manicured green lawn. Maybe you throw a frisbee around before you enjoy your picnic lunch. And if you get too warm, you can find shade under a very large rectangular neoclassic pavilion that looks like it's straight out of an ancient Roman town, complete with pillars. Or, if you want some exercise, you can always jog along several shaded trails. All in all, Cheesman Park is a lovely place to visit. But here's the thing. Amidst all that beauty, there's a darker side. There are reports from visitors who have laid down on the lovely grass to enjoy the sunshine and are overcome with the feeling that something has grabbed them from beneath the earth, holding them down. When they try to sit up, it's as if whatever is holding them down does not want to let them go. This strange feeling isn't the only creepy thing that people have experienced in Cheesman Park, and that's probably for a good reason. There are 2,000 bodies still buried underneath their feet. And it's believed that these spirits are allegedly restless. Perhaps it's because their bodies were left behind and are still accidentally being dug up during park renovations. You see, back in the 1800s, Cheesman Park was the Mount Prospect Cemetery. In 1858, General William Lemaire set aside 320 acres in Denver as a cemetery for the city's elite. He named it Mount Prospect. The first person to be buried there was named Abraham Kay, who died in March of 1859. The second man, John Stoffel, was a German gold rush prospector who came to settle a score with his brother-in-law. Stoffel was hanged for murder, and both he and his brother-in-law were buried together in one grave at the edge of the cemetery. In 1865, 40 acres within the cemetery was renamed the Calvary Cemetery, and it was specifically for Catholics. Unfortunately, Mount Prospect became a popular spot for murderers and transients to hang out in, and many of the plots were mass graves for outlaws, vagrants, and unclaimed victims of typhus and smallpox. Locals began to refer to Mount Prospect as Bone Hill or Old Boot Hill, not exactly the lovely final resting place that Larimer had in mind. General Larimer eventually left Denver, and the cemetery fell into the hands of John Whaley, a cabinet maker who hoped to be the new undertaker. By 1866, Mount Prospect claimed there were 626 bodies buried within its boundaries. But Whaley didn't exactly maintain the cemetery. Gravestones were vandalized, citizens let their cattle graze on the property, and gophers reportedly burrowed through the graves, upturning bodies and knocking over headstones. Squatters even set up temporary shelters there. By 1873, Congress decreed that Mount Prospect was actually on federal land given to the United States through a treaty with the Arapaho. They offered to sell it to the city of Denver for $200 as long as it would remain a cemetery. It was renamed the City Cemetery. There was a specific section for the Odd Fellows, the Masons, Roman Catholics, Jews, the Grand Army of the Republic, and Chinese immigrants. The Chinese immigrants section was closest to the paupers' graves. The Hebrew Burial Society maintained their 20 acres, but sections became neglected due to lack of money or family to care for it. The Pest House opened in 1881, just south of the Jewish section. Many victims of smallpox, as well as people who were simply dropped off there, were buried in the potter's field, behind it in mass graves. By the 1890s, the city cemetery was in a sad state of almost total neglect. Folks used it as a spot for committing all kinds of crimes. Grave robbing was so popular that the city decided that the graves needed to be moved and the land would serve the community much better as a park. Senator Teller quickly renamed it Congress Park. Families were given just 90 days to relocate their deceased loved ones. So it seems like they tried to do the right thing, but they may not have hired the right man to manage the task. According to Legends of America, Undertaker E.P. McGovern was hired as the project manager in 1893. It was his job to make sure that all 5,000 graves were successfully moved. He was to charge $1.90 for a brand new coffin, and it was his job to make sure each exhumed person was safely placed in the new coffin and safely relocated to other local cemeteries. But McGovern had other ideas. He began dismembering some of the bodies and placing them in up to 3 child-sized coffins, charging $1.90 for each one. Now, believe it or not, in the first few days of the mass exhumations, locals arrived in huge crowds to watch the process being carried out. Not because they had loved ones there, but because they were morbidly curious. But on March 18, 1893, just a few days into McGovern's scheme of overcharging people and desecrating bodies, the Denver Republican printed an article about the debacle. The headline screamed, "The Work of Ghouls," and part of the article said, quote, "The line of desecrated graves at the southern boundary of the cemetery sickened and horrified everybody by the appearance they presented. Around their edges were piled broken coffins, rent and tattered shrouds, and fragments of clothing that had been torn from the dead bodies. All were trampled into the ground by the footsteps of the gravediggers, like rejected junk." End quote.
I can't believe that people would go and watch that. Like, I know they used to go to public hangings and stuff. That was a big deal. But to me, I don't know, that's just morbid.
Well, as you know, people are curious, and they'd want to go and see the cemetery being dug up.
Yeah. Now that I said it, I don't know if I'd go, but I'd look at pictures probably.
I'd want to go and see it. McGovern was fired, except not all the graves had been moved yet. 2,000 bodies were left behind. In the early 1900s, Denver's mayor, Robert W. Speer, wanted to make the new Congress Park a nice spot for visitors. But the city didn't have the money to put into it. And so Mount Prospect stayed the way it was, an area now clear of gravestones, but still containing bodies, some of which were now above ground in splintered coffins, abandoned during the relocation process. So it's no surprise that the area residents began experiencing the paranormal. There were numerous reports of sad and confused-looking apparitions knocking on people's doors and windows. Others reported the sounds of moans emanating from the open graves. One gravedigger named Jim Astor even swore he felt a ghost land on his shoulders. Astor, who had secretly been looting the graves as he moved the bodies, may have decided he angered the spirits because he never returned to his grave-digging job again. Grave robbers continued to pillage the unmarked plots and open coffins on a regular basis. The city responded by erecting a wooden fence, but open graves were still clearly visible all throughout the area. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, why? Well, the city of Denver was low on funds, and they just didn't have the money to take care of it properly. By 1894, they went ahead with their park plans, planting bushes in the still open graves. In 1902, they filled in the remaining holes with dirt, even though there were still unmoved coffins underneath. Eventually, the widow and children of pioneer Walter Scott Cheesman stepped forward and donated $100,000 towards the construction of the neoclassical pavilion that I mentioned at the top of my story. It was completed in 1909, but 2,000 bodies still remained right there, still underground. So it might seem pretty obvious to you, since now you know the history of Cheesman Park, that it would have a weird vibe occasionally, or why sometimes visitors to the park, who may or may not know the history, have strange experiences. It might start with a sudden and unexpected sense of dread and despair. Then you might hear little whispers on the air. At first, you might dismiss them as voices carrying from other parts of the park, but as the whispers multiply all around you, you realize that they can only be coming from several people that you can't see. If you venture into the park in the middle of the night, and we won't ask why, maybe it's a shortcut from point A to point B. Maybe you even think that you hear the sounds of children playing. At first, you might wonder, with concern, why young children are playing there in the middle of the night. As their laughter and giggles get closer, you might even swear you catch sight of them. They're dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and although that alarms you, you might call out to them. After all, they're still unsupervised youngsters alone in a park. But before you can get close enough, they just seem to fade away. Now, maybe at this point, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when the eerie sound of a woman singing reaches your ears. She's often heard at nighttime, wandering the park as she sings a heartbreaking song. If you catch sight of her, she too will just simply fade away. If it's a full moon, you might even experience what many people have experienced, a time slip. You may be walking across the perfectly normal and quiet park one moment, and then all of a sudden, find yourself walking past rows of gravestones. As you quicken your pace, the old cemetery just seems to spring up around you and looking exactly like it did over 100 years ago. And then there's that strange sensation that I mentioned at the top of my story, that even in the middle of the day, after you walk along the hiking trails, you might lay down on the soft, inviting grass. After a few moments, when you try to sit up, some sort of force grabs a hold of you, pinning you against the ground. It seems like a sort of sleep paralysis, even though you weren't asleep. And no matter how hard you try, you can't move. Thankfully, after a few minutes, the feeling dissipates and you're able to sit up again. Reports of people experiencing all of these things have been swirling around Cheesman Park for over a century. It's not hard to believe that many of the people still buried underneath Cheesman Park may have restless spirits, or that some of them are just simply confused, wondering what happened to their final resting place. Now, it probably doesn't help that the graves continue to be accidentally unearthed. In 2008, during renovations of the botanical gardens, several graves were accidentally disturbed. In 2010, 4 skeletons were unearthed during irrigation work. All of the accidentally exhumed bodies were carefully and respectfully moved to other local cemeteries, of course.
That's good.
Yeah, it is.
I'm glad they're taking care of it now when they're finding them.
I know. It's too bad. You would think that they would have had the plots of these people and maybe just went back before they did all this. And
I don't think they would have. If you were saying that a lot of them were vagrants and victims of smallpox and unclaimed people from the pest house,
right,
they wouldn't have had plots. They wouldn't have. A lot of them would have been unnamed and unmarked even then.
That's true. As part of an ongoing quest to give all 5,000 of Mount Prospect's buried bodies their names back, the Denver Library Public Archives actually has a list of all the people who were buried there between 1889 and 1893. You can actually Google it pretty easily and view it. It lists their names, the plot number, and how much they paid. Most of the plots were between $2 and $7. The list is 19 pages long of single-spaced type names, just from those 4 years. So, is the Cheesman Park truly haunted? Or is the energy there magnified by all the people who know its history and continue to share it? Either way, when you think about it, it's pretty morbid.
It is. I think it's intriguing too. But I mean, I don't know if it's better whether you know the history when you're there or if you don't. Like if you're just visiting and you might just think you had a day in a lovely park if you don't know the history.
Right. To me, if you live there and you know the history and then you come forward and claim that something happened to you, I could see where people would shoot that down. But if you're a visitor to the park and you have no idea about the history of it, I think that would be a true experience. Or if you have little ones that suddenly, how they like to throw themselves down on the ground and just roll all over the place and then they can't get up, then coming from a child, I would say that's pretty remarkable, that there's probably definitely something happening.
That would be frightening. If I had a kid there and that happened, that would be really, truly frightening.
And that reminds me, because we have a cemetery here where we live, and I've taken you there many times, that back in the 1980s, a contractor came in to supposedly just go through and clean out some of the
brush and stuff.
Brush and things like that. And they plowed over almost the whole entire graveyard over an embankment. And to this day, you can look over the embankment and there's tombstones littered everywhere. And some people have brought some of the tombstones back up and stood them up somewhat or laid them down on the ground so that other loved ones can find their now tombstones that were broken all to hell.
Mm-hmm.
They've been pieced back together somewhat, but it's pretty sad because if you were to walk through there, you'd never know that part of the cemetery had ever been used.
Right. You wouldn't know it existed. It would just be this little hill next to the river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty disgusting. And they said, the pastor back then said, well, I was away and it was a mistake. And they never did anything about it. The guy never got in trouble.
Yeah.
It's sickening.
Yeah.
Well, with all that said, as always, if you'd like to dig deeper into tonight's stories and do some research of your own, you can check out our sources and our show notes, and that will give you a jumping off point.
Yeah, you can go right down the rabbit hole with us. And I guess that about wraps it up for this episode. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
That's right. We'll see you all next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.